In this video, we're going to react to Captain Steeeve reacting to the Wall Street Journal dual engine failure, engine cut off switch, quote unquote, exclusive. Now, quick catch up. This is the checklist for a 787 Dreamliner, which if you have a dual engine failure, the checklist calls for fuel control switches, both of them being set to cut off, then run. Now, usually you set it to cut off for about 1 second and then back to run. It's more of like an off and on again. Especially when you're at 600 feet off the ground, you wanna move these back to run fast. And these switches are very unlikely to mistakenly both be in the off position because A, you can't take off with them in the off position, and B, they have gates that require very specific manipulation of the switch to actually get it to turn off. And then, of course, a second memory item here is the ram air turbine switch. Push and hold to basically manually deploy the ram air turbine, which would also automatically deploy in the event of a dual engine failure, but this sort of verifies that. Now, my name's Kevin. I'm also a jet pilot, except I fly a Phenom 300, and Captain Steeeve is referring to a Wall Street Journal article, which the Wall Street Journal is calling an exclusive, which I think is really interesting. You can see his piece here, Air India update fuel cutoff switches in cutoff position according to Wall Street Journal. Now, this has been talked about for a while over the past few days, and this is why I think it's odd that the Wall Street Journal is saying this is an exclusive, because it was really, I mean, there were a host of other magazines and air news companies covering this already. So I find it odd that the Wall Street Journal says this is exclusive, that they're finding out about the plane's fuel switches being at the focus of this investigation. But what is interesting about this Wall Street Journal piece, and we'll see if Captain Steeeve talks about it, but if you actually scroll down to the bottom, take a look at this. The US government and industry officials have been frustrated by what they perceive as the slow pace of downloading, analyzing, and sharing the context of the contents of the plane's black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and the data recorder, to indicate when switches were moved into what positions and what was said inside of the cockpit, along with what kind of warning messages or engine indicators there could have been. Now, why is this important? Well, because originally India mentioned that they were going to send these black boxes after finding them, which took 2 days and 4 days to find, which is quite a while. But originally they were going to send them to the United States for investigation. The United States got involved, went to India, then the United States left, so our FAA or NTSB inspectors came back to the United States without the black boxes because India decided that they wanted instead to keep the black boxes and do the data analysis themselves, where they recently opened a new lab for analyzing such accident data. So basically, Indian investigators, they want to download the data themselves. And so this is where we see the Wall Street Journal says American investigators remained, but they have since returned home basically empty-handed without those black boxes, which is interesting because a lot of folks are like, hey, we kind of want to know about this, mostly because we also have GE engines on these planes, which is an American company. This is a Boeing, which is an American company plane. So there's a lot at stake for America and the aviation community. Now, there's been a lot of speculation around why would these switches potentially have been in the off position? Why would they stay in the off position? Now, one theory is that this was terrorism, and basically one of the pilots wanted to, check out, which is very bad and devastating, and nobody wants to say that. But look, the checklist is off, or cut off, rather. It's technically not off. It's technically called cut off, and then run. That's what the checklist is, which is very different from a 737 or most other planes. Most other planes, when you look at their emergency procedures for dual engine failure, you do not see touch fuel control valves to cut off and run. It's very, very unique. And so even myself, I was surprised when I saw this checklist on the 787 Dreamliner, but then again, I don't fly the Dreamliner. So this is surprising, and it's nice to look at this checklist. But again, it shouldn't be left in the cutoff position. In fact, before that ram air turbine switch is manually deployed, you're supposed to move the switches back to run. So did they make a mistake? Did they move these switches to cutoff and then run? And is that why during their troubleshooting at 600 feet, they just didn't have enough time to complete their checklist, or what? Let's see what Captain Steeeve has to say about this.
We're expecting the first official findings until last month.
All right, let's get to it.
Sudden loss cuts off the position of the switches and how...
Yeah, this is what the switches look like, by the way. This is some nice like music and dramatic or whatever, cool editing. But the point is, these little arrows right here, they point to these little guards that show you have to lift these switches up to switch them down.
Yeah, she did.
71 crash. And this is not the video that we wanted to make. In fact, the information that we're now gleaning from the preliminary report that's been handed over from AAIB to the Indian government is nothing short of stunning. And I don't...
Well, the report is not out yet. Mind you, this is what a lot of people are getting frustrated about. There are only leaks of the report out. In fact, just minutes ago, we got a report in The Hindu that says, don't worry, the AAIB's preliminary report will be released, quote, very soon. So it's not out yet, Captain Steeeve, but leaks are out. So a lot of this is regarding to, you know, or how should I put it? Like, you know how news companies do this? They're like, according to people familiar with the matter, you know, these anonymous leaks or whatever. That's what you get here. You don't have the official report yet.
Don't use that word loosely. It is a stunning conclusion, and it surrounds the fuel control switches. More on that in a minute. But there are major news agencies now around the planet that are reporting on the findings of that preliminary report.
Okay, let's go.
To a little bit after.
Here, preliminary findings indicate, this is from the Wall Street Journal, that the fuel control switches were turned off, leading to a loss of thrust. Correct. But the question is, were they put back in the run position? This is what the Wall Street Journal doesn't tell you. They don't tell you that they were turned off and then off at the time of the crash. This is why it's frustrating that the preliminary report is not out yet, because we're just getting speculation around this. But let's see if Steeeve clarifies this.
Takeoff. So in this video, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about what happened, how it happened, and then we're going to delve into a little bit of why. We're not going to get too far into that, but we're going to try.
All right, come on.
Turbine, or the RAT, deployed short.
Yes, we know the ram air
Wall
turbine
Street Journal that it was a dual.
These are things that could potentially cause the ram air turbine to deploy. Hydraulic failure, electrical failure, dual engine failure. It is possible, mind you, that there was some kind of catastrophic electrical failure that ended up leading to a dual FADEC or sort of reset or reversionary mode. In fact, that's what some people are talking about more consistently now on the mainstream media, that something potentially with those FADECs reset. In fact, take a look at this piece right here. You can see Air India 171 crash, TCMA failure may have caused Boeing 787 crash. And then if you jump down a little bit to get some more color on this, however, according to the person that they've interviewed here, per previous incidents, the chief on the list is the TCMA and the FADEC. The TCMA is the thrust control malfunction accommodation, and FADEC is the full authority digital engine control. The TCMA tells the FADEC, which controls the airspeed on the thrusts on the engines, whether or not it's on the ground. If the TMCA senses it's on the ground, it throttles back the engines without pilot input, adding that the Air India flight could have potentially been suspect, or let's see, on the Air India flight, the fact that there are known computer problems causes me to suspect the thrust control malfunction accommodation and FADEC could have led to this problem. So basically, some error, whether it's a catastrophic electrical failure or as this person is saying, the TCMA resetting, sending the signal that maybe this aircraft was actually on the ground when it wasn't, pulling that thrust back to zero, could have been a factor here, which is obviously not what you want in a takeoff. Now, look, one of the reasons people always ask me, like, Kevin, why do you cover this? Why do you cover this? Well, because as a jet pilot and a passenger, you know, I don't always fly, but as a jet pilot and a passenger, I want to know, because I think it's not only good for the aviation community, but it's also good for passengers. I mean, here's a video clip, just so you know, like, not only do I fly jets, but, you know, I don't just operate them in simulators. I'll also go stall them in real life because it's important. Here's just an example so you could see it. This was just a few days ago.
6 Echo Foxtrot, roger.
There we go.
Stall, stall. Stall, stall. Stall, stall.
There it is.
Stall, stall.
All right, power.
So you can actually see the pusher there, and it's really, we have a hydraulic pusher on this aircraft. And so this is the yoke. That's not me pushing it forward. It's actually a stall prevention mechanism that tries to get you to nose down before stalling.
Stall.
There it is.
Stall, stall.
You could see that. And again, I'm only showing this to say, like, the reason I'm so passionate about understanding what's going on here is because I'm in aircraft flying these, and it's important to know what's going on and why these failures are happening to try to prevent mistakes in the future. So, okay, this is all just catching up so far, Captain Steeve. We've seen the video. We know the ram air turbine was deployed. Let's get to the news,
after
please.
takeoff. So let's answer some objections to that. Is it possible that there's a procedure where that could take place? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. There are procedures where the pilots would, in flight, turn one of, or in some cases both, fuel control switches to cutoff. Let me explain the first situation. If you were to lose a single engine and the Boeing 787 flies just fine on one engine, even with the gear down, or if the...
This is true, by the way. The planes fly just fine. Flaps for takeoff or land configuration, gear out, one engine flight, fine. You got an engine on fire, you're gonna turn your fuel control valve off because you wanna stop feeding that fire, right?
flaps were retracted prematurely. In fact, the Air India pilots went into the simulator and tried all of those scenarios. We did a video, I think, about 10 days ago, where we talked here on this channel about several of the theories of how this airplane could have lost both engines. The Air India pilots went into the simulator after that and tested all of those scenarios, and with a total of
different pilots, mind you.
Electrical failure, a total hydraulic failure, they could not induce a dual engine failure from those two things.
Right. That's what's so weird, is like a catastrophic electrical failure, even losing all of your power doesn't turn your engines off. That's why we think it was something having to do with like the FADEX reverting to a reversionary mode, but that means both of them failed, which is weird. And I think that's why the person's talking about the TCMA, because it's one thing that could cause both those FADEX to tell the engines to go to idle.
Even with the flaps brought up prematurely and the gear down on one engine, the airplane still flew out.
Correct. That doesn't matter.
But if one engine had failed right at rotate, is it conceivable that one of the pilots mistakenly grabbed the other fuel control lever and...
This, absolutely not. There is no rush to turn the engine off. I've heard this theory before. I think it's crazy to think that there was a single engine failure and they accidentally turned the wrong engine off. Could it happen? Yes. I just think it's crazy because in a jet, there's no rush to turn it off unless it's on fire. Now, is it possible that there were warnings that the a certain engine was on fire and then they've proceeded to the wrong checklist? Maybe. But we certainly didn't see the engines on fire, and that seems like a low chance. But let's just say maybe there's a possibility. But it seems crazy to me because when people fly a jet, it doesn't matter if the darn thing is off or on, the fuel valve is off or on if you have just a flame out, because the drag isn't going to change. It's not like a propeller plane where you're like, oh crap, pitch for a blue line. Oh no, I need to feather the prop. You don't have to do that. There's no feathering a jet engine. So I don't like this argument.
Put it to cutoff. Well, it's not very probable, and here's why. Our training, everybody's training follows this pattern. If you have an engine failure on rotate, which we test all of the time, right? When we're in training in the simulator, we practice this all the time. You don't touch
not just in the simulator, I do it in real life.
Anything until a minimum of 400 feet. And you normally don't touch anything until about 1,000 feet. There's something called an engine out altitude.
Okay, so some people, usually you get positive rate of climb, gear up, 400 feet, you go flap up, autopilot, yaw dampener on. And some people do that at 1,000. but these are like, everybody's got their different systems and procedures here. But yes, there is usually a minimum altitude where you're just not doinking with stuff.
And that's set for every takeoff for just that scenario where you'd lose a single engine. The pilot flying will say my aircraft. The other pilot will then begin to bring up the checklist. The pilot flying will say quick reference checklist. They'll pull out a laminated checklist. They'll then begin to coordinate their...
You're lucky you got a laminated checklist, bro. That's for training. In training, you use a laminated checklist. Usually you have a booklet that you have to go page through. The quick reference handbook is actually pretty thick. But it, you know, you get pretty comfortable at opening it quickly.
Efforts back and forth to get through the first 3 or 4 steps on that checklist after they get above 400 feet and the airplane is climbing safely. And
mind you, Steve's not talking about memory items here. The first few items on each of the most critical checklist items are memory items. That's critical. And so I'm a little surprised Steve's not talking about this. This is the quick reference handbook from the Boeing 787. These are memory items. Above the dotted lines are memory items. So you must remember these. And the whole point is that you do this before ever needing to reference the stupid manual, because it's critical you do it right away. You know, it's something that you just don't have time for. You need to react right away, which is why it's entirely possible these pilots did everything as intended, that they did their memory items and they were just too low because of some other failure, such as that MCA.
And the landing gear has been brought up. At that point, the pilot flying will say, let's start the checklist. The pilot monitoring will do the first item, which would be auto throttle, and they'll point to the auto throttle the switch, and they'll say left side or right side, depending on which engine has failed. And then they both concur with that, and they turn it off. Next is the thrust levers. And then the one pilot flying.
That was a diagram of both of the switches turning off, which was a bad example because the editor didn't realize that you were only supposed to show one of these switches going off. But this part doesn't matter. We're going to fast forward a little bit. He's just going through some of the procedure for a single engine shutdown, and I've kind of already ranted about that enough. Let's look at this. I like this diagram.
Failure. That's also on that quick reference checklist. The dual engine failure requires the pilot monitoring to take both fuel control levers and place them to cutoff and then back to run. That's the entire procedure.
Back on.
They don't sit and cut off for a while. It's not like you count to 1, 2, 3 and then put them back.
It's not the entire procedure because you also need to deploy the ram air turbine, but that's okay.
You go right to cutoff, right back to run. Now, that procedure obviously was not done. There is never...
Well, we don't know that it wasn't done. That's the problem. We don't know because we don't actually have the full preliminary report. We don't know that the procedure wasn't done. Yes, we have heard rumors that investigators are focusing on the fuel control switches, but we do not know that they did not complete this procedure. We know the ram air turbine was deployed, which does mean that we could have reset the fuel control valves and deployed the ram air turbine, but it was too late to gain altitude anyway because the FADEX had reverted to zero thrust.
Ever in the history of commercial flight ever been a procedure where you take both fuel cutoff switches and put them to cutoff and leave them there? Especially not
totally agree.
Seconds after rotate. Now, one of the things that's bothered me in this whole scenario from the beginning was how quickly the ram air turbine, or the RAT, deployed. Shortly after takeoff, and I'm talking 4 or 5 seconds after takeoff, that RAT comes out. The RAT is there as a last resort.
It's in the checklist, bro. It's in the chat. I don't think Steve looked at this checklist.
In case there is a dual engine failure. And a dual engine failure normally takes some time to progress. Those big old engines need to spool down. It might take 30 to 60 seconds for them to completely fail to send the message to the RAT to deploy. It's designed to be something that happens at altitude, maybe 35,000 feet. Both engines flame out. They spool down. The RAT then deploys to give you electric, hydraulic. It doesn't give you any thrust, but it gives you enough to fly the airplane and shoot an approach when you get down and talk on a radio. Now, that RAT came out almost immediately. Why would that RAT come out so quickly? Because the whole flight didn't last more than
Because you pushed the button!
60 seconds. The only explanation is that both of those fuel control levers were placed to cutoff. That would...
No! It's in the checklist! It's not the only explanation! Steve!
Immediately deploy the RAT. The rat now, the airplane is in what's called airborne logic as opposed to ground logic. What's the difference between those two? When the airplane is on the ground and there's
Wait on wheel switches. Okay, we get it. I'm not going to watch all of this.
out, goes to the run position, and then it stays there for the duration of the flight, unless, of course, there's an engine failure and you need to bring it back to the cutoff position. But taking it from run to cutoff is also that same three-step procedure. You have to grasp it, pull it up over the detent, pull it down, and release it because it's spring-loaded to the cutoff.
He's just talking about how the little switches work. We've already talked about that many times.
You may never have an answer to that. To be quite honest with you, never have an answer to that. But we do need to delve into that because I think it's hugely important and it's a big question that's sitting out there that at least we need to try to attempt to answer. And that's where my other area of expertise comes in. I'm not just Captain Steeeve, who flies an airliner for a major airline, and I'm also Dr. Steeeve. And I've been a doctor now for, I think I had my doctorate about 15 years ago. But I've been a trained, experienced counselor for well over 30 years. And I've counseled thousands of people, families, individuals.
Oh, we're going into mental health. This is where we go mental health and the terrorism side.
Most extensive training any pilot gets through that program 8 years earlier as a student, and I earned my wings.
All right. Oh, yeah. What is this?
Next evaluate about
What's this
6
popped up
there.
there?
It's student in this. Just isn't. I just said that. I said, look, my aircraft. I said, what's going on, man? And he explained to me that he had been up until about 3 o'clock in the morning on the phone with his father, who lived in the Midwest, and his father was attempting to commit suicide. His dad had a loaded gun in his lap.
Okay. All right. So this is the last part of this video is about mental health, which is very sad. And yeah, pilot fatigue, very real issue. You know what's actually incredible? When I was just looking at this data, I looked at my health data in my app, and I looked at my what was it? My what did I look at? Was it the VO2s or something? An easy, yeah, I mean, that's an option too, but an easy one that shows it nicely is I want you to see this. And I'll tell you, there's something crappy about becoming a pilot and going through all the training, and it's this. Can you see where in this last year I had a substantial amount of pilot training? This is a step counter. It's the whole. December, January, February, March, April. Like, actually staying fit as a pilot is hard because it's so much classroom work and studying and actually sitting in a plane flying, and you're not walking, obviously. So fatigue, depression, lack of physical fitness, these are all things that could be components of, well, sadness that, yeah, could also lead to the unfortunate possibility that there was an oopsie-doopsie that shouldn't have happened. Now, do we think that's likely? It depends. We still don't have that preliminary report, and that's what everybody is looking for right now is why is that preliminary report getting delayed? There are a lot of suspicions now circulating around that, but I will say the good news on this channel is if anything or anything that we talked about here makes you nervous at all, you can go to metkevin.com/life. That's one E because we've met each other now. metkevin.com/life, hit enter, and you can get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes. You can Apple Pay and Android Pay for it. It's the same insurance that Lauren and I use. Check it out at metkevin.com/life. Paid sponsor of the channel.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.